The heavy tropical heat pressed down on Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imy as he moved through the dense jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal. It was August 19th, 1942, and the thick canopy of palm trees and tangled vines blocked out most of the sunlight. He made notes in his diary that morning, recording observations that would later capture the bewilderment so many Japanese soldiers experienced when they first faced American forces in combat. Imy had just arrived with 916 other men from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment. They'd come by destroyer under cover of darkness, completing a nighttime landing that Japanese military leaders believed would be the beginning of taking back Henderson Field. Command had assured them the Americans had only around 2,000 troops on the island, poorly trained, easily scared, soft from comfortable living back home. Colonel Ichiki himself had brushed aside suggestions to wait for additional reinforcements. "These are Americans," he'd told his officers. "We will push them into the ocean before the sun comes up." None of these battle-tested soldiers, veterans of fighting in China and across Southeast Asia, understood they were about to experience something entirely new in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. They weren't simply facing defeat, something these men who had known nothing but victories since 1937 couldn't even imagine. Instead, they would encounter a complete dismantling of every tactic they'd relied on, every strategic plan they'd made, every certainty about Japanese superiority that shaped how they fought. The jungle itself would turn against them. The darkness that had been their ally throughout the war would become their enemy. Equipment and coordination advantages that seemed overwhelming would destroy the belief that Japanese soldiers couldn't be beaten in hand-to-hand fighting. The events leading to this moment had unfolded just 2 weeks earlier. On August 7th, 11,000 United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division had poured onto the beaches at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift commanded these leathernecks as they carried out Operation Watchtower, America's first major offensive push of the Pacific War. The plan appeared simple enough on paper. Capture the nearly finished Japanese airfield, set up a protective perimeter, then hold on until reinforcements arrived. What they actually faced was about to become the longest and most grueling campaign the Marine Corps had experienced up to that time. The environment itself would push human bodies and minds toward their breaking points. Guadalcanal stretched across nearly 90 miles in length and about 25 miles wide. Mountains dominated the interior, rising 8,000 feet into clouds that seemed permanent. At the coast where Henderson Field stood, a strip of kunai grass mixed with swampland and thick jungle meant you could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature was crushing and humidity never dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes came in clouds so thick that soldiers couldn't help but breathe them in. Rivers and streams that looked clean and refreshing in aerial photographs actually carried parasites and disease in their waters. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually put more men out of action than enemy bullets ever could. But on that first morning, the Marines discovered the airfield was barely defended. About 3,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 sailors abandoned their posts and ran into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and most importantly, the airfield itself. By the evening of August 8th, American engineers were already working on finishing the runway. They decided to name it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot who had died at the Battle of Midway. Within days, the first planes would touch down, and the island would become the base for what history would call the Cactus Air Force. Japan responded quickly, and the results were devastating for American ships. The night of August 9th brought Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, leading 7 cruisers and a destroyer through the darkness in a perfectly executed surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island turned out to be the worst naval defeat the United States Navy had ever suffered. The heavy cruisers USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra were sent to the ocean floor in less than an hour. Over 1,000 sailors perished in burning water. The remaining Allied ships pulled back, and they took with them most of the supplies that were still waiting to be unloaded on shore. The Marines found themselves cut off and isolated, facing an opponent that could now send reinforcements while American supplies ran short. They had only about half of what they needed. What Japanese commanders in Tokyo didn't understand during those early days in August was how critical Henderson Field had become. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled who ruled the sea during daylight. Planes based at Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single element would shape everything about the campaign to come. The Japanese owned the darkness, using fast destroyers to slip in troops and equipment on runs that sailors nicknamed the Tokyo Express. But when the sun rose, American planes took control of the sky. Japan had to take Henderson Field back quickly before the Americans could build up their defenses. The Imperial General Headquarters gave the job to Lieutenant General Haruki Hyakutake and his 17th Army, operating from Rabaul. Hyakutake didn't have many units ready to use. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was stationed at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest fighting force was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, stationed near Guam. They'd originally been planned for the operation against Midway, which never happened after the Japanese lost that naval battle in June. Colonel Ichiki had been an instructor at the infantry school and had earned respect as a skilled tactician. But he was also known for making quick decisions without hesitation and believing strongly in the fighting spirit of Japanese soldiers over American equipment and firepower. Before traveling to Guadalcanal, Ichiki received specific instructions to wait until his full regiment arrived before trying to retake the airfield. However, Ichiki had little regard for American soldiers as fighters. He'd read reports from China, from the Philippines, from every place where Japanese forces had clashed with Western troops. They lacked discipline, he believed. They fell apart when pressed hard. In close fighting, where soldiers used bayonets and grenades, Japanese warriors held a clear advantage. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers brought 917 men from Ichiki's first group to Taivu Point, about 15 miles away from where the Americans held their defenses. The landing happened without any problems. The Americans never noticed. Ichiki right away sent out patrols to look for American positions and assess how many soldiers they faced. It seemed like standard military procedure, but it would turn out to be a terrible mistake. On August 19th, a Marine patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal path toward Coley Point when they encountered Japanese soldiers. The two groups opened fire on each other in a quick, brutal exchange. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and found documents showing that a substantial enemy force was operating in the region. More importantly, the papers revealed that the Japanese had no idea how many American troops were there. Captain Brush hurried back to Marine headquarters with the intelligence he'd gathered. General Vandergrift quickly grasped what was about to happen. Japanese soldiers were coming. The attack would probably come from the direction of the east, he thought. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen the defensive positions along a sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenoru River. The name stuck, though the actual river was called the Ilu. Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Creswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the river, placing machine guns so their fire would cross and cover the sandbar from multiple angles. What unfolded over the next hours would become one of the most lopsided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki didn't wait for information from his missing patrol or for more troops to arrive. He chose to attack right away. Late on August 20th, moving into the early hours of August 21st, he ordered his men to make a direct charge straight across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine taught that spiritual willpower and bold night assaults could overcome American firepower. Ichiki was convinced his experienced soldiers could pierce American defenses through courage and close-quarters combat, where Japanese fighters used bayonets and explosives with lethal skill. A Solomon Islander named Jacob Voscher, who had escaped from Japanese captors after being tortured, stumbled into Marine lines just after midnight with desperate news. Japanese soldiers were attacking. Minutes later it began. Hundreds of Japanese troops ran across the sandbar, screaming their battle cries, firing weapons, throwing grenades. They rushed straight into a zone of death the Marines had prepared with careful planning. The M1917A1 Browning machine guns began their rhythmic hammering. These weapons, refined during the First World War, were the backbone of Marine firepower. Each gun could spit out 600 rounds every minute continuously, as long as the cooling jacket remained filled with water. The Marines had arranged them in positions where each gun covered areas the others couldn't, leaving no part of the sandbar exposed. Japanese soldiers tumbled to the ground as the heavy .30 caliber bullets ripped through bodies. Those who somehow crossed the sandbar came face to face with 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister ammunition, essentially massive shotgun blasts that shredded anything in their path. The assault went on for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese troops rushed toward the concentrated gunfire. Some reached the Marine lines and fought hand-to-hand, using rifles, knives, and whatever else they could grab. The Marines met them with equal intensity, using every method available to fight back. The defenses the Marines had built held strong. Overlapping fields of gunfire prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As morning light began to appear, Colonel Ichiki's offensive had run out of momentum completely. Roughly 800 of his soldiers lay dead or wounded across the sandbar and in the shallow water. When daylight came, the Japanese got no respite. General Vandergrift sent in Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, to push forward. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks rolled across the sandbar and began searching through coconut groves for any Japanese soldiers who had found shelter there. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched from a Marine position and later wrote about what he witnessed. The tanks moved through the trees, turning and pivoting, spraying sheets of yellow flame. We didn't know there were so many Japanese hiding in those groves. Group by group, Japanese soldiers were flushed from their hiding spots and cut down by tank gunfire. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru had concluded. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, close to 800 were gone. Around 128 survivors, mostly from units that had remained near the beach, vanished into the jungle. They sent a radio transmission to the 17th Army reporting the catastrophe. Colonel Ichiki was among the dead, though different stories circulated about his actual death. Japanese official accounts stated he burned his regimental colors and performed ritual suicide. Other witnesses said he died in a final charge against the Marines. Marine losses came to approximately 40 soldiers killed and wounded. The impact on the surviving Japanese soldiers was psychologically devastating. Papers they left behind and accounts given after the war revealed the trauma of learning that a whole regiment had been destroyed in a single night. The Americans had not fought according to what Japanese training and doctrine had predicted. They remained calm during the night assault. They didn't break when warriors charged at them screaming. Rather, they waited behind carefully prepared defenses, let the Japanese run into kill zones, and used concentrated firepower to systematically destroy them. The most troubling discovery came from examining what the Japanese left behind and surveying the ground where the battle occurred. The Americans had resources and materials on a scale that Japanese intelligence had vastly underestimated. The Browning machine guns performed flawlessly. They never jammed, never overheated past their design limits, never broke from careless upkeep or lack of spare parts. Every single Marine appeared to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad could transport. The artillery the Marines could call upon was far beyond anything Japan could put into the field. The teamwork between infantry soldiers, artillery units, and naval gunfire from ships in the water offshore showed an organized system of destruction unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. In the days following the disaster at the Tenaru, more Japanese soldiers were already making their way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto arranged a big naval operation to back up the next effort to recapture Henderson Field. 3 slower transport vessels departed on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 troops from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 sailors. When the naval battle in the eastern Solomon Islands damaged one of the transports seriously, Japanese commanders decided that slow transport ships were no longer an option. Instead, they would rely on destroyers for what people started calling the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers brought nearly 5,000 soldiers from Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express proved highly effective for moving troops quickly. Destroyers made the journey from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, reducing how long they were exposed to American aircraft. But this approach had a serious limitation. Larger weapons and equipment couldn't travel this way. Artillery guns, tanks, trucks, and critically sufficient amounts of food and ammunition had to stay behind. This supply problem would ultimately seal the fate of every Japanese assault on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived carrying only what fit in their hands and on their backs. They had to rely on hunting for food locally and sneaking supplies through American positions. As weeks passed, Japanese troops found themselves battling not just American guns, but starvation as well. General Kawaguchi decided September 12th would be when his forces struck at Henderson Field. He planned to attack from 3 different directions. One group would push in from the west along the shoreline. Another force would come from the south, cutting through dense jungle to assault what Japanese intelligence thought was the weakest section of American defense lines. Kawaguchi would lead the main assault force coming from the south, moving along an inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi didn't realize was that American intelligence officers had already pinpointed this ridge as the spot where Japanese would most likely attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, led a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th. There, his men discovered enormous supply piles, proof that a powerful Japanese force was gathering nearby. Edson immediately recognized the Japanese strategy. They would attack from the south using the ridge as their entry point. Edson asked for permission to create a defensive position on the ridge itself. General Vandergrift gave approval for the operation. The defensive preparations began in earnest as September arrived. On the 10th and 11th, Edson assembled roughly 840 Marines from his radar unit and the parachute battalion, positioning them methodically along the ridgeline. He approached the task with the same deliberate precision that had shaped his earlier defensive strategy at the Tenaru. Machine gun emplacements were sited to create overlapping fields of fire that would catch attackers from multiple angles. Mortar teams registered their weapons on the pathways where Japanese forces would most likely advance. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines calculated firing solutions for defensive barrages, preparing to rain destruction on any assault. Every position took advantage of what the terrain and available firepower could offer. The ridge itself formed a narrow coral backbone, stretching nearly a kilometer in length, divided into 3 prominent hills, blanketed with kunai grass and scattered trees. Steep ravines dropped away on both sides, choked with dense jungle so thick that passage seemed almost impossible in places. Such terrain invited infiltration tactics and night attacks. Yet in the hands of disciplined defenders, it could become a graveyard. When Kawaguchi's assault began during the darkness of September 12th, the nature of his attack revealed lessons learned from Ichiki's failed frontal charge. This assault came as a far more calculated effort. Japanese infantry moved through the ravines flanking the ridge, attempting to encircle and trap the American positions. Small probing units felt out the American defenses, searching for vulnerable sectors. Upon discovering weakness, larger forces converged for concentrated breakthrough attempts. The engagement descended into savage confusion. Marines in the pitch black sometimes found Japanese soldiers close enough to grapple in hand-to-hand struggles, close enough to exchange grenades. Yet the meticulous preparation held firm. As Japanese formations massed for their breakthrough efforts, mortar and artillery fire shattered them apart. The 11th Marines unleashed over 2,000 rounds into the darkness, explosions so near to Marine positions that shrapnel from their own shells tore into friendly troops. Machine gun barrels turned red from sustained fire. Marines wielded whatever came to hand: rifles, pistols, knives, shovels, in desperate close-quarters fighting. Sergeant Major Jacob Vaser, the same scout who had provided warning of the earlier Tenaru assault, moved through the lines offering encouragement and directing Marines toward infiltrating Japanese troops. Sergeant John Basiloni manned a critical machine gun position in the defense. When enemy fire killed or wounded his crews, Basiloni continued alone, repulsing successive waves of attackers. His actions that night would earn him the Medal of Honor, one of 2 Marines receiving that decoration at Edson's Ridge, with 19 more earning the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese assault had not broken through. though Kawaguchi possessed additional forces ready to resume the next evening. Edson contracted his lines toward the center of the ridge, consolidating his strength. General Vandergrift dispatched reinforcements, raising total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would return, but this time the Marines met them with even tighter formations and concentrated firepower. The second night's assault proved even more brutal. Kawaguchi committed his remaining troops in desperate driving attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position truly impenetrable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly into machine gun fire, falling by the hundreds. Some attacks reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being repulsed. At one point, the crisis grew so severe that Edson himself took up a rifle and joined the firing line. Yet firepower and defensive preparation prevailed once more. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely shattered. Japanese losses were staggering. Roughly 830 to 850 soldiers left dead on and around the ridge. Marine casualties amounted to approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded among the radar and parachute battalions. The ridge that would forever bear the names Bloody Ridge and Edson's Ridge had become testimony to American defensive effectiveness. For Japanese survivors, the battle delivered a startling revelation about modern warfare. Captured diaries and post-war interviews consistently echoed the same shock. Japanese forces had anticipated fighting enemy infantry under cover of darkness, where their training and warrior spirit would dominate. Instead, they collided with artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with precision they could not counter. American commanders had known the Japanese were coming. They had prepared interlocking killing zones. They had waited patiently for Japanese troops to enter those zones, then destroyed them with coordinated fire. The engagements at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns repeating throughout the campaign. Japanese attacks relied on courage, darkness, and close combat skill. American responses delivered overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined operations, and positions designed to maximize their advantages. The results became predictable. Catastrophic Japanese losses balanced against significant but manageable American casualties. Yet numbers alone could not capture jungle warfare's true horror. The island itself became an impartial killer. Malaria ravaged nearly every man who remained for weeks. By December, the 1st Marine Division reported over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical disease incapacitated roughly 2/3 of divisional strength. Dysentery became universal. Fungal infections ate through exposed skin. Jungle rot produced open sores, refusing to heal in the oppressive humidity. Dental decay without treatment brought abscessed teeth and spreading infections. Japanese forces suffered far worse. Their supply situation meant starvation from the beginning. Soldiers theoretically received field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver sufficient quantities. Men survived on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became routine. Medical supplies nearly vanished. Quinine for malaria, prevention exhausted quickly, never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers frequently died from infections easily treatable with proper medicine. Later captured Japanese documents painted a horrifying portrait. Medical officer reports from late October noted over 60% of the 17th Army's Guadalcanal forces incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had fallen to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at 50 per day, mostly from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply vessels protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats temporarily severed the Marine supply line, but remained temporary. By October, supply flow became reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while uninviting, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Machine gunners possessed abundant ammunition to fire their weapons until barrels wore out, then request replacements. Field hospitals included surgical capability, plasma for transfusions, sulfur drugs for infection, and evacuation of serious cases to rear hospitals. Japanese logistics consisted of whatever could ride destroyer decks or infiltrate through American lines. Soldiers made single rice balls last entire days. Ammunition restrictions meant orders often permitted firing only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if fortunate, amputation without anesthesia if less fortunate, or death from infection. Seriously wounded troops often received grenades and were left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest campaign offensive. General Hyakutake himself arrived on Guadalcanal to personally command. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including veteran troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the principal effort coming southward through dense jungle, similar to previous approaches. This time, Japanese forces would possess greater numbers, better coordination, and artillery support finally delivered by destroyers. The offensive opened on October 23rd with a preliminary western assault. 9 Japanese tanks, remarkable sights on Guadalcanal because transport logistics made them rare, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment soldiers from the American Division, stood ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank destroyed all 9 Japanese tanks in succession. The attack collapsed with severe casualties. The main assault came during the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked southward, aiming to pierce American lines south of Henderson Field. They encountered the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Pula, reinforced by 164th Infantry Regiment elements. The night's fighting became legendary in Marine history. Japanese waves attacked throughout the hours of darkness. Individual breakthroughs were met by immediate counterattacks. Gunners fired until weapons failed, then seized rifles and continued. The 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, explosions landing yards from Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood prepared for naval gunfire support if needed. At one critical juncture, only a single Marine battalion separated Japanese forces from Henderson Field. Yet they held firm. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, became critical to defense once more. When ammunition grew scarce for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried rounds through enemy fire to keep guns operating. He repaired damaged weapons under fire. When enemy troops overran one position, he grabbed a pistol and led a counterattack, restoring the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu lay dead, killed by machine gun fire during the night's assault. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers died attempting breakthrough. American casualties reached several hundred killed and wounded, severe but sustainable. October also witnessed major naval engagements decisively shifting the balance around Guadalcanal. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal spanned 4 days from November the 12th through 15th, producing some of the war's most intense surface combat. During a confused November 13th nighttime melee, American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese bombardment forces, including battleships Hai and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the action. Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more damaged. But the Japanese lost battleship Hai, disabled that night and sunk by aircraft the following day. More critically, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. During the night of November 14th to 15th, battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment but encountered USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a stunning display of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington fired 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely discern their target. Kirishima sank with tremendous loss of life. Most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transports, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and those were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before completing unload. Japanese convoy losses exceeded 5,000 men. This represented the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with properly equipped large ground forces. For troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had anticipated reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned naval battles had failed, convoys were destroyed, no further help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men faced surviving on even less. Medical supplies became non-existent. Makeshift field hospitals where doctors merely watched men die became common. Captured diaries from this period showed slow deterioration. Entries described rice rations reduced to single bowls daily, disease spreading everywhere, bodies burned when soldiers possessed strength, realization that no supplies would arrive, men consuming grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, soldiers collapsing into desperate starving shadows. December brought the final accounting. Japanese command at Rabaul made evacuation decisions. They could not publicly admit defeat, yet privately recognized continued operations meant complete 17th Army destruction. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained, down from peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 possessed strength enough to walk away. Those left behind were either sick, severely wounded, or so malnourished that movement was nearly impossible. The evacuation, designated Operation K, stands as one of the most triumphant Japanese naval operations of the entire war. Over 3 nights in early February 1943, destroyer runs patterned after the Tokyo Express allowed Japanese naval forces to extract over 10,000 men from the island. This was an impressive feat given the obstacles, yet it couldn't hide the scope of what had been lost. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had numbered roughly 36,000 at their peak. Of these, between 25 and 30,000 perished, approximately 14,800 in direct combat, with another 10 to 15,000 succumbing to disease and starvation. American losses were steep as well, though the nation had capacity to absorb them. Marine and Army personnel fighting on Guadalcanal suffered roughly 1,600 killed in action, with over 4,000 wounded and thousands more temporarily sidelined by tropical illnesses. Yet American factories and population reserves could replenish these numbers. Fresh divisions were already being prepared for deployment. New ships and planes rolled off production lines faster than combat could destroy them. The balance of power had fundamentally shifted. What Guadalcanal meant for Japanese military thinking cannot be understated. This was the moment Japanese forces faced defeat in prolonged ground warfare for the first time. Attacks had all failed. Traditional Japanese tactical approaches had produced horrific casualties. The understanding that American soldiers possessed not just better equipment, but genuine tactical capability, solid leadership, and the capacity to endure brutal conditions demolished everything Japan had assumed before the war. Surviving Japanese officers who later recorded their memories or gave interviews consistently returned to particular points. First, they had dramatically misjudged American combat abilities. Second, the gap between American equipment and supplies far exceeded what their intelligence services had indicated. Third, Japanese supply lines proved fundamentally unable to support sustained fighting against an enemy controlling sea and sky. Fourth, willpower and battlefield skill couldn't overcome systematic disadvantages in weaponry and material. What Japanese survivors reported afterward showed consistent understanding. These men had regarded themselves as superior fighters. Their preparation was more rigorous, their acceptance of death more complete, their mastery of night operations and hand-to-hand combat unmatched. Yet Guadalcanal taught them something unexpected. Wars are won through systems. Americans had systems for everything. Systems for getting supplies forward, systems for treating the wounded, systems for artillery strikes, systems for coordinating aircraft. Every mechanism worked. Japanese systems never functioned properly because the infrastructure hadn't been established from the start. Captured Japanese veterans and those later interviewed by researchers provided accounts that directly contradicted official Japanese claims about why the campaign was lost. They conceded that American forces demonstrated remarkable skill when defending fortified positions at night. They acknowledged Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and horrific conditions while staying combat effective, because logistics kept them sustained. They admitted American firepower was organized, concentrated, and precisely applied. One American battalion produced more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technological dimensions of American superiority were substantial. Guadalcanal saw Japanese troops armed with Arisaka rifles, weapons requiring manual action between each shot. Marine forces first carried M1903 Springfield rifles, likewise bolt action, though the M1 Garand semi-automatic gradually became available. The Garand held 8 rounds and fired automatically, providing advantages in close fighting. Machine guns presented an even more dramatic contrast. The American M1917A1 Browning operated on water cooling and could fire continuously as long as water and ammunition kept flowing. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and portable but lacked the ability to sustain prolonged fire. In fixed defensive positions, this proved absolutely crucial. Artillery imbalance was perhaps most consequential. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be dismantled and hauled through dense jungle. These 75mm guns delivered accurate supporting fire when called for. Observers embedded with rifle companies could request fire and receive shells within minutes. Japanese artillery capacity remained limited, difficult to transport through dense vegetation and perpetually short on ammunition. Naval gunfire provided capabilities Japanese forces simply couldn't duplicate. Offshore destroyers and cruisers could bombard Japanese positions or deliver responsive fire support for Marine units. Radios connected shore-based spotters to naval vessels, enabling accurate targeting. Air dominance intensified as the struggle progressed. The Cactus Air Force flying from Henderson Field under difficult conditions gradually won control of Guadalcanal's airspace. Marine and Army aviators flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted waves of Japanese bombers. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck at Japanese positions, transport vessels, and concentrations of troops. Rabaul-based Japanese air units operated at extreme range limits, leaving minimal time to accomplish their missions. The final American push in January 1943 showed how completely the situation had reversed. Major General Alexander Patch, commanding the 14th Corps, now comprising both Marine and Army divisions, coordinated attacks that progressively broke Japanese resistance. This offensive enjoyed overwhelming artillery support, continuous air power, and naval bombardment. Japanese forces, though resolute, faced starvation, sickness, and depleted ammunition. On February 9th, American patrols found the Japanese gone. General Patch transmitted his message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. Fighting concluded. Half a year of continuous combat delivered America's first significant ground victory against Japan. More critically, it established approaches and exposed realities shaping the remaining Pacific campaigns. Japanese survivors absorbed lessons devastating to their pre-war military philosophy. The belief in Japanese warrior superiority crumbled. Bravery and tactical ability proved inadequate when facing systematic disadvantages in force. Night assaults and close-quarters tactics, the foundation of Japanese success in China, couldn't overcome American defensive arrangements. The importance of supply chains and resupply became obvious, not peripheral matters, but absolutely central to sustained fighting. Control of air and sea determined what happened on land. These hard-won understandings from Guadalcanal's blood and starvation should have reshaped Japanese military strategy. Certain officers grasped the significance. Staff Officer Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who observed the campaign firsthand, later recorded that Japan required complete strategic re-evaluation. The Americans he witnessed were conducting warfare as an industrial enterprise, where manufacturing capacity determined everything. Japan couldn't prevail in industrial competition against America's production capabilities. Yet Japanese military tradition, rooted in generations of custom and recent triumphs, resisted such radical rethinking. Official statements attributed defeat to insufficient supplies, naval losses, and underestimating American defensive arrangements. They avoided acknowledging Japanese military doctrine itself contained fundamental flaws, that everything Japan understood about warfare from Chinese campaigns had become obsolete against a modern industrial adversary. Surviving Japanese troops, those captured or who lived past war's end, witnessed a transformation they never anticipated. They'd entered as confident soldiers of an unbeatable realm. They departed as famished, disease-ridden survivors of catastrophic collapse. Many afterwards recalled Guadalcanal as when certainty about Japanese victory first evaporated. Later accounts from captured or surviving Japanese troops documented this profound psychological shift. They described discovering truths leadership had obscured. Americans weren't weak, but overwhelmingly powerful. Not merely in weaponry, but in organization, logistics, command quality, and ability to maintain fighting operations continuously. Japanese troops exhibited courage and competence. Numbers didn't follow. American troops operated through systems and provisions Japanese couldn't equal. American military perspectives on Guadalcanal emphasized different takeaways. For the Marines and soldiers engaged there, the campaign vindicated that American forces could fight Japanese units through jungle brutality on equal terms. The myth surrounding Japanese invincibility disintegrated. American defensive strategies proved sound. Coordinated multi-unit tactics functioned effectively. American soldiers, appropriately trained and supplied, demonstrated clear superiority over Japanese personnel. Yet Americans simultaneously gained respect for Japanese forces as relentless, capable opponents willing to continue fighting when victory became impossible, preferring starvation over surrender, accepting death instead of retreat. The determination Japanese troops showed pushing forward despite hopeless circumstances, enduring deprivation rather than capitulating, choosing death rather than withdrawal, left lasting impressions. The difference in approaches regarding prisoners and surrender illustrated deep cultural separations. Americans attempted to persuade Japanese surrender through leaflets, radio broadcasts, food and medical assistance to those captured. Such initiatives produced little success. Fewer than 1,000 of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops who served there survived as prisoners. Most were incapacitated by sickness or wounds incapable of further resistance. The consequences of Guadalcanal extended beyond island geography. Japan's inability to retake Henderson Field and subsequent pullout showed the defensive zone could be pierced. Allied strategy changed from simply holding ground to mounting aggressive campaigns. American industrial advantages could translate into military success through systematic application. For Japan, Guadalcanal signaled beginning of the end. Losing trained troops, experienced aviators and warships faster than new personnel and equipment could be manufactured meant the position only worsened. Evacuation silently conceded Japan couldn't wage conventional warfare against American industrial strength. Men who fought Guadalcanal, Americans and Japanese, carried their service for all remaining days. Marine and Army survivors became instructors for replacement units, transmitting hard lessons about jungle fighting, holding terrain, and orchestrating multiple unit actions together. The 1st Marine Division departed in December 1942, needing extensive recovery time before returning to active fighting. Japanese evacuees faced grimmer circumstances. Operation K's survivors got reassigned throughout the Pacific Theater, bearing psychological scars of collapse and knowledge that American forces represented far greater threats than wartime broadcasts had suggested. Most perished in subsequent fights as Japan's military standing continued declining. Guadalcanal bore battle marks across decades. Wreckage littered the jungle and beaches, destroyed aircraft, ruined vehicles, abandoned gear, and unexploded ammunition. Henderson Field underwent expansion and improvements, becoming crucial to subsequent Solomon Island operations. Military analysts and war planners extracted lessons from Guadalcanal about amphibious assaults, jungle combat, moving supplies, managing air-ground cooperation, and linking naval operations to land campaigns. The battle proved modern warfare demanded more than courageous fighters and battlefield experience. It required manufacturing capacity, dependable supply systems, technological advantages, and ability to sustain prolonged operations. The human toll was extraordinary for both armies. Above 7,000 American and Japanese personnel died in naval engagements near the island. Ashore, American losses included over 7,000 killed, wounded, or unaccounted for. Japanese deaths surpassed 30,000 total. Additional thousands on both sides endured lasting health problems from sickness and injury. Despite tremendous suffering, military strategists saw the cost as justified. Guadalcanal marked the moment when Allied strategy shifted from defensive reactions to offensive action across the Pacific. It validated that Japanese forces could be beaten in ground warfare. It confirmed patterns of air and sea control defining future campaigns. The encounter between Japanese troops and American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal fundamentally centered on collision between two completely different warfare philosophies. One side held the warrior spirit supreme, believed dedication could overcome material shortcomings, trusted tactics could produce success regardless of resources. The opposite view held that systematic harnessing of industrial strength, logical supply systems, and concentrated firepower as multipliers of force, and coordination between different military branches created dominant power. That jungle became the setting where these opposing worldviews met. The result, though half a year of unrelenting brutality preceded the inevitable finish, demonstrated that coordinated firepower and supply systems, married with capable tactics and resolute fighters, generated military capacity Japanese forces simply couldn't match. For Japanese soldiers who endured Guadalcanal and lived telling their experiences, the campaign signified when reality shattered mythology. They learned their preparation rested on mistaken premises. Their tactical approaches suited different conflicts. Supply systems failed them from the start, and their nation pursued military objectives it couldn't accomplish. American combatants gleaned different yet equally vital lessons. They showed they could meet Japanese soldiers through combat's brutality. They demonstrated American manufacturing might convert it into military power. They perfected approaches to jungle warfare, helping through subsequent struggles, and they eliminated the notion of Japanese superiority, replacing it with factual appraisal of determined, capable, but ultimately beatable opposition. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops became frightened, not primarily of American combatants as individual warriors, though they proved lethal, rather by the methodical, overwhelming, continuous unleashing of firepower and material American units delivered every time they fought. It was terror arising not from dread of dying, which Japanese troops had been taught to embrace, but recognition that heroism and sacrifice meant nothing against enemies whose supplies never depleted, whose casualties received treatment, whose guns kept firing, whose planes commanded the sky, and whose manufacturing could refresh losses quicker than battle could deal them. What transpired when Japanese forces first confronted American jungle warfare at Guadalcanal triggered a transformation fundamentally altering the Pacific War. Subsequently, Japanese forces defended against an adversary whose material resources only multiplied month after month. Guadalcanal's jungle fighting became the standard subsequent operations would follow, confirming American forces could fight and prevail in challenging ground against committed opposition, given adequate supply, efficient cooperation, and overwhelming firepower.